afternoon, everybody. Um, we're starting our third class, our third meeting, and
Les faltó tantito.
I would like to make a few comments regarding our previous topic, which is Hasidim and Nagdim. And I just wanted to say that just as much as, and even more than we've seen that the Misnagdim were influenced by the Hasidim, in some aspects, we mentioned both the Mussar movement and also, if you remember, the fact that today, for example, the Misnagdim, the Litvish, the Litaim, treat their leaders quite in a similar way to the way Chassidim treat their leaders, with great admiration, and Reb Chaim Kanievsky receives kvittels, which means, notes of requests and things like that. We spoke about the influence of the Hasidim on the Litvish, on the Litvaks, but not less than that, and even more than that, the Misnagdim influenced the Hasidim. And I just wanted to mention that since already, I think, the third generation or fourth generation, at least the early 19th century, the Hasidim has started to become much more traditional, much more halachic, much less mystical, and much more institutionalized. And what is the most, I would say, the most conspicuous or imminent manifestation of this institutionalized Hasidism? It's the fact that the leaders from the early 19th century and on were no longer active, but rather what? Sons and grandsons of the previous leaders, which means that Hasidism has adopted the hereditary model of leadership. Hereditary model of leadership is something very institutionalized. I mean that it's not something that takes the leader as something charismatic and a one-time personality, but it's due to what Chassidim calls Zchut Avot. It's not a Hasidic term. It's Zchut Avot, meaning that their fathers would like to see their sons continuing their path, and so the leadership passes from father to son, or from grandfather to grandson, or from father-in-law to son-in-law. And this way, Hasidism has become much less revolutionary, much less mystical, much more kind of traditional way of leadership. If you know the scholarly Max Weber's analysis of three types of leadership, he says that there is the charismatic leadership, there is the institutional leadership, traditional, what he calls traditional leadership, and there's the rational leadership. So Hasidism went from charismatic leadership to traditional leadership, and traditional is hereditary in many cases. And not only that, but Hasidism has become in many ways, and that's interesting, Hasidism in many ways became even more traditional and more halachic and more stringent, more machmir than the Litaim, than the Litvish. Hasidism has adopted many Kabbalistic customs, which from a certain stage and on, they preserved even more strictly and more avidly than the Hasidim, than the Litvish preserved the halacha. And most of their norms are more stringent, more machmir than that of ordinary halacha. Indeed, from time to time, they have some different times of prayer, which is a little more lenient, and they're, sometimes the Hasidim pray always later than the others. And some, flexibilities here and there, but basically, Hasidism is more stringent, and Hasidim have more norms than the ordinary halacha. That is only something I owe you from the previous class. And also another thing, which I wanted to mention, during the 19th century in Galicia and in Hungary. Galicia, if you don't remember, is a part of what used to be Poland that was annexed to Austria, later Austro-Hungary. It is part of Poland that was annexed to the Austrian Empire. Galicia and Hungary were places in which the most radical orthodoxy developed. If we speak about radical orthodoxy, even zealotry, orthodox zealotry. Uh, most, most of the great fanatics of the 19th century and later 20th century were Hasidim of the area of Hungary and the Carpathians. So if we saw the Hasidim as having more, you know, Ahavat Israel, love of every Jew, and things like that, it's a little simplistic because the same Hasidic tradition of Ahavat Israel also gave room to forms of Hasidism that were very, you know, radical and uh, not anti-Jewish. I wouldn't say that, but against many parts of the Jewish people that they didn't accept, and they fought really harshly against them. Not just secular Jews, but also moderate Orthodox Jews. They were also fighting against them. This is a real type of ultra-Orthodoxy already in the 19th century, which developed mainly in Hasidic circles in Hungary and Galicia. This is some debt that I still owe you from the previous class, and it will be relevant to this class as well. So now we begin to talk about Zionism and the reaction of Orthodoxy to Zionism, which is a very, I would say, things still relevant, still actual in our time as well. As you know, Zionism has come to became an important movement in the Jewish world at the end of the 19th century. It is important to say that we always speak about Herzl as the founder of Zionism, but it's important to say that in most of these historians begins at the Zionist movement not with Herzl but with Chovevei Zion. Chovevei Zion is the movement, the pre-Herzlian movement that started off in 1881, in Russia, and they are those who sent the first pioneers to establish the colonies in Eretz Israel before Herzl came with his program. Also, others are important Zionists before Herzl, like Usishkin and like Pinsker, and others. But Chovevei Zion really founded the movement for settling Eretz Israel. So, what was new about Herzl? Herzl was really innovative. First of all, I would also say that already the first Aliyah to Eretz Israel, you know, we number the Aliyot, Aliyah Rishona, Aliyah Shneya, first Aliyah, second Aliyah. The first Aliyah was the Aliyah of Chovevei Zion in 1882. And only the second Aliyah was already in the 20th century after Herzl was active in the scene. So what was so important with Herzl that we call him the founder of Zionism, or the founder of political Zionism, which is more accurate? The fact is that Chovevei Zion were very nice people with very great idealistic aspirations, but they didn't found a political movement that started off the idea of a Jewish state. The Chovevei Zion had great ideas about settling the land of Israel, renewing the face of Judaism in some aspects, but they didn't mention the word Jewish state. So the fact that Herzl wrote a book, the Judenstaat, the State of the Jews, or it was translated as the Jewish state. The original is the State of the Jews, which is a little different. I'll say a word about it later. But the idea that Herzl spoke about the state was indeed innovative, was something new. It's great to go and found new villages and new colonies in Eretz Israel, but to have the idea of a political Zionism, a Zionism that is aimed at forming a state in Israel, in Eretz Israel, is indeed something new. Not only that, but Herzl also was about establishing a movement that will work in the political scene. Herzl is a very impressive, I would say, we can be proud that the founder of our national movement is such an impressive person, because not all the great national figures of all the peoples are so impressive. You know, he was a really well-educated person, an intellectual, a man who wrote not just books, but also was a playwright. He wrote also plays for the theater that were all, some of them were successful in Vienna of that times. He was a journalist. He was a very talented person, a very cultured, civilized person. And but a part of his education was the fact that he believed in politics. He didn't believe just in acts. He believed in politics, and he actually sacrificed not only his life, but also really in some ways the his money, his living, his livelihood, his family for his project. And he died very young, relatively, at the age of 44. And most of his project was the first Zionist congresses, but the fact that it ran so strongly and so efficiently after his death is in many ways thanks to him. And you should think about it. I mean, we all know the dates and the years, but sometimes we don't think about it. In 1897, Herzl opened the first Zionist Congress. In 1917, Balfour has already given the Balfour Declaration. There's only a gap of 20 years, that's all, between the first Zionist Congress and the Balfour Declaration. Now, the Balfour Declaration is really the dream that Herzl was always about. The greatest and most important superpower in that time, the most important superpower, and not just the most important superpower, the superpower that has already taken, conquered the land of Israel, Eretz Israel at that time. 1917 is also the time where the British came into Eretz Israel. In 20 years, this movement that only has just started really got most of its targets. It's not yet a Jewish state, but it's the recognition of the most important superpower of the time. Now, Herzl in 1997 said, in the first Congress in Basel, he said, now when I speak about Jewish state, people think that I'm a dreamer. But in 5 years, and at most in 50 years, everybody will acknowledge that. He said that in 1997, and so prophetically, I would say, in exactly 50 years from the time he said that, the UN recognized the Jewish state, and just only half a year later, the Jewish state was a fact. So indeed, in many ways, Herzl was taken by many at that time, not just as the king of the Jews, but also a kind of a prophet. And he was indeed a very, very impressive person, and gave a push to the Zionist movement that no one from Hovei Zion or any other of the figures around him could give. But now, after we've said all those very, I would say, some compliments about Herzl, we should remember a few things as well about the founder of political Zionism. Herzl came from a family that was in many ways assimilant. He was, today there is a controversy between the historians about how assimilant was his family. Today there is a kind of tendency, at least here in Israel, to show a little more traditional aspects of Herzl's family. But basically, he didn't get much of the Jewish education. He did celebrate a bar mitzvah, but also a few years later, he made a confirmation, the Christian ceremony as well. Not exactly Christian confirmation, but something similar to that. He lived really next to the Neolog synagogue in Budapest, where he was born, but he wasn't really a synagogue goer, and when he needed to recite a Hebrew verse in the Zionist Congress, he had to write it in Latin letters so he could read it. Not only that, but in his early years, or not so early, by the way, in the 1890s, before the Zionist idea came to his mind, he had this quite shocking idea that all the Jews, actually, we can't really remain as Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is growing. We can go all to the church in one day, and respectfully, he also suggested it to the Pope. Respectfully and in a dignified way, we should all convert to Christianity. He had that idea in mind as well. Even when he did start his Zionist project, yes, and really wanted many, as much as he could, to recruit rabbis to his project, you know, a famous rabbi of that, a rabbi of that time who came to visit him on Christmas Day, saw him and his family lighting Christmas tree. and candles on the Christmas tree as well, and was shocked by the fact that the founder of the Jewish national movement is lighting the Christmas tree. So in many ways, he was a man very integrated in the European culture, and kept some of his assimilant aspects or characteristics even when he was a Zionist leader. Later on, he stopped with some of them. He didn't circumcise his son, by the way. He had a son, Hans. He didn't circumcise him. Many aspects remained things that, for at least many of the traditional Jews, religious Jews of the time, were very, very thorny, very, very unsympathetic. And in that respect, and let's now think about the Zionist idea itself, national movement, political Zionism. Where do we find this in the Jewish traditional sources? Nationalism is a 19th century European movement. And the idea that every nation should have a state, which is the core of the nationalist idea, is not a Jewish idea, is a Gentile, is a Goyish idea, is a European idea. And not only that, the thinkers, the ideologues of nationalism in Europe, in 19th century Europe, starting from Herder in the late 18th century, and later on many others, when they came to form, to formulate the nationalist idea, and said that every nation should have its own state. Later on, the term that was coined for that is every nation should have its own self-determination, הגדרה עצמית, as we use in the Hebrew term. The idea of self-determination or an independent or sovereign state for every nation made it necessary for these thinkers to formulate what is a nation. Okay, so a nation is a group of people which what do they have in common? I can ask you this question. What makes a group of people into a nation? They have a few things in common. What are they? Language. Okay, so that's the first thing. Herder, one of the main thinkers of
history.
History. Herder said language and history as well. What else?
Land.
Sorry?
Land.
Land. Exactly. Land. Territory. Correct. Right. What else?
Cultural.
Sorry?
Cultural.
Culture. Right. Culture. And let's be accurate about that. When we say culture, we should speak about popular culture. There is a high culture and there's popular culture. High culture is not accessible to all the people, right? Not every German reads Goethe, and not every Englishman reads Shakespeare, but everyone eats the same food and wears the same clothing. So we mean mainly popular culture. It's correct. And the fifth thing, okay, so you're politically correct ones.
People.
But in the 19th century, they said also race, the ethnical common denominator. So we have about 5 things, which you all mentioned now. It's not me, it's you, and I agree with you, which is language, land, territory, culture, meaning popular culture, and race and history. So these are 5 things, and also we should add another aspect, which is the subjective aspect. They have a national consciousness. They see themselves. The mind is also important. They see themselves as belonging to one nation. But the subjective aspect is nothing if you don't have the objective aspects of, once again, territory, language, popular culture, race, and history. So when Herzl comes and demands a state for the Jewish people, he has a problem with this definition, because for the last 2,000 years, the Jewish people didn't really have all those denominators, and we'll return to that in a moment. But he says, yes, we do feel as a nation, and we also have the common faith of our fathers, as he calls that, and the common old history, ancient history, as a common denominator for all of us. And this requires the fact that we can claim a state for ourselves as well. Not only that, but Herzl said another important thing. This, by the way, is in the footsteps of Spinoza, which we mentioned in the last lesson, the first lesson. Another common denominator is the fact that both us, we, the Jews, and the Goyim, the Gentiles, see us as a nation. So even if we don't have all those aspects, the fact that everybody agrees that we're a nation is important, because even if not all the characteristics apply to us, sometimes the model has to include also some irregularities, some extraordinary cases. Maybe the Jewish case is extraordinary, but it is still a nation. And Herzl knew that the fact that the anti-Semites of his time were identifying the Jewish people as a separate nation was said in a pejorative way, was said against them. You're a state within a state, you're a nation within a nation, you're not a part of us. But he said, okay, if we can't beat them, join them. He said, one day, the anti-Semites will be our allies, will be our friends, because we have the common goal of having a separate place for the Jews. They want to kick us out of Europe. We will go out of Europe and we'll have a common cause. We'll have a common target, which is quite an original idea, I would say. And so Herzl is about going to Eretz Israel. At some stage, he gets an offer from the British Minister of Colonies, who offers him Uganda. Herzl tends to accept that as what he calls just a night shelter, a temporary solution before we go to Eretz Israel. But later on, there is a strong opposition within the Zionist organization, and he leaves this idea. Some of his supporters, by the way, are surprisingly the Orthodox in the Zionist religion. But basically, Herzl is about going to Eretz Israel, following Chovevei Zion, but establishing a Jewish state there. And before we go to settle the land, Herzl says we have to get a charter. Charter meaning, in this case, a license by the nations, given by the nations to go to Eretz Israel and to establish our state. And he speaks with the Sultan, Turkish Sultan. He speaks with the German emperor, the German Kaiser. And he speaks, of course, with the other superpowers as well, with Britain, France, and even goes to the Pope to get his consent as well, because he thinks we can't just go there and do things on our own. We have to get some political stamp, political license to do that. That's the idea of going to Eretz Israel. This is the land of our fathers.
We can't hear you. You're on mute.
Here I am. So now let's think. Suppose you are Orthodox rabbis in the late 19th century or early 20th century, sitting in your armchair, reading a newspaper that there's a certain person, Herzl, who suggests that we Jews all go to Eretz Israel and establish a Jewish state there. Why? Because here there's anti-Semitism, we can't really beat them, we can't really stop the Gentile hatred against us, and this is not our place. We should go to Eretz Israel and establish our own state there. Suppose you're Orthodox rabbis, then what would you say? Good idea, bad idea, good for the Jews, bad for the Jews? Try to think in the mind of a rabbi in the late 19th century. What would you say? Okay, some of you would say good, some of you would say bad. Let's start from those who would say it's a good idea. Why is it a good idea? In Orthodox terms, and we already know what Orthodoxy is about. Okay, we know what is Orthodoxy. We'll study about Orthodoxy. What an Orthodox rabbi would say, why why Zionism is good for Jews and good for Judaism.
Because the authenticity of the land.
Okay, so first of all, Rabbi Mordechai says, we see that you're a halachic person. There is a mitzvah of Yeshuv Eretz Israel, settling the land of Israel. So it's a mitzvah, so we go with it. Another reason?
Biat HaMashiach.
Biat HaMashiach, this is not our function. This is God's function. But yes, another reason?
you'll be free to practice the religion and not depending on the political authorities.
Yeah, very great. Another reason, we can really observe the mitzvot freely, and there's not we are not dependent on this ruler or another law that would say you're allowed or not allowed to do what we see that even today it's problematic, in Europe. Shchita and Brit Milah are often, not taken for granted. So we have our own land, we can practice the mitzvot freely. Yeah, fair. Another reason.
There are many mitzvot that you can only do in the land of Israel.
Sorry?
There are many mitzvot that you can only do in the land of Israel.
יפה מאוד. Another reason is that some mitzvot are mitzvot which are dependent on the land of Israel, such as Shemitah and Trumot Masot. And exactly so, it's actually increasing our ability to perform the mitzvot, right? Other reasons?
Yes.
שלא יהיה עם הגויים.
Sorry?
לא להיות עם הגויים.
I would say yes, preventing assimilation. Of course, you're right. Strengthening Jewish identity. The fact that we're among the Goyim is a cause of assimilation. Both Zionism and religion and orthodoxy are against assimilation. So we all fight assimilation by going to Eretz Israel, and we're not influenced by the Goyim. Of course, you're right. There's just another reason that, if you allow me, I would add another one. In Jewish lives, if anti-Semitism in the late 19th century has become more violent, and we know it became more violent, for example, in Russia, yes, there were pogroms in the 1880s and later on as well. So if there are problems, there's a religious idea of the religious mitzvah even, of pikuach nefesh, or atzalat nefashot. So we go to Eretz Israel, we save the life of Jews. It's also a religious value. So there are good reasons for rabbis to support the Zionist idea. Now let's go to the other armchair. And here you are, a rabbi from Hungary, for example, very strong, radical Orthodox, and they're anti-Zionist. Why would you say, what are the religious Orthodox reasons that you would give against Zionism?
The Shvuot, no? The promise.
Okay, Shvuot, we'll get to that in a moment. There are the 3 oaths, according to the Gemara. We'll get to that in a moment. According to which we have to be passive in the exile and wait until Bi'at HaMashiach, until God takes us to Eretz Israel, and we should not be active in that. We should receive the divine verdict that sent us to exile passively and not try to change that. This is one reason. Okay. Another reason.
שהחילונים?
חילונים, נכון? The
לא,
leader.
לא,
Who said that? I totally agree.
שהחילונים לא ישלטו.
נכון, נכון. Rabbi, did you say that? Yes.
No, Yoshua Kassin.
Yoshua, okay. Thank you for that. Nachon. First of all, the Chilonim, the secularist Jews, were the leaders of the Zionist movement. Let's not forget that Herzl was an assimilant, or at least secular Jew before he came to the Zionist movement, and even later he remained a secular Jew. His number 2 was Max Nordau, married to a Gentile woman. And the other leaders were Chilonim, secularist Jews, of course. Yes, they ruled the movement. I would say another thing as well. It's not only about secular movement, it's also secular leaders. It's also a secular idea. The idea of nationalism was not born in the Batei Midrash and the Batei Knesset, that's the shuls and study houses of the Orthodox. It's a European Gentile idea. Now, and the idea of state and sovereignty, we can find in the Talmud, in the halachic books, the concept of a state. So it's a Gentile idea. But even more than that, think about it more. Reb Chaim of Brisk, one of the most prominent Torah scholars in the time, said that actually the Zionist movement does not aim to go just to establish a Jewish state. It aimed to secularize the Jewish people by giving them a new type of identity. And the state is just a means for that. Their main aim, their main goal is to secularize the Jewish people, which is, of course, a little kind of suspicious idea, but it's a means for secularization. If you go and give the young people a new core for their identity, a new basis for their identity, which is not religion. This is a means to secularize the Jewish people. So we can see, actually, from these few reasons that we gave now, that Orthodox serve have good reasons to oppose Zionism, and Orthodox serve have good reasons to support Zionism. And now I would like to present it in a more systematic way. What the claim I would like to make, the argument I would like to make here in this class, is that we can divide. The first division is supporters and opposers. Okay, this is easy. But I would like to make another distinction. Yes, this is like a distinction among supporters about the position itself, pros and cons. But within every camp, within every position, we can divide the reasons or the justifications for the positions to two levels or two types. One type is the pragmatic reasoning, pragmatic justification, both to oppose or to support. The other source or the other type of the justification is the, I would say, messianic or even metaphysical, sometimes even Kabbalistic reasoning for support and for to oppose the Zionist movement. Both the supporters and the opposers have metaphysical, redemptional, and a meta-historical reasonings, Kabbalistic often, reasonings both to support and to oppose. And that makes the whole story much more interesting, I promise you. So now let's get to the sources. If we want to make the clear distinction between all these types, I would say, among the supporters, the two greatest names are Rabbi Reines and Rabbi Kook. Rav Reines and Rav Kook. Rav Reines was the founder of the Mizrahi movement. He was already a supporter of Herzl in the late 19th century, and in 1902, he established within the Zionist organization, he established a movement called the Mizrahi. The Mizrahi defined itself as the Orthodox Zionist movement, the Orthodox faction within the Zionist movement. And when Rabbi Reines established that faction, other rabbis asked him, how can you do such a thing of going together with the secularists? You're a rabbi, and you should establish organizations for promoting Judaism. How can you give a hand to the secularists? That's against the idea of התחברות לרשעים. אל תתחבר לרשע. Don't make friends with the evil ones. And the evil ones in this sense are the secularists, because they're called evils, not because they're bad people, but because in halachic terms, they are sinners. They don't follow the halacha. So if the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says, אל תתחבר לרשע, I'll show it in a minute, how can you go and make friends or unite yourselves with the evil ones, those who forego, those who transgress the halacha? And Rabbi Reines gave a very pragmatic answer to that. And let's see the text on the screen. Rabbi Reines wrote a book called Or Chadash al Tzion in 1902, and he says, יש שני מיני התחברות בין האנשים זה לזה. התחברות תכליתית והתחברות אמצעותית. הראשונה, כאשר אחד מתחבר לחברו להידבק בו וללכת בדרכיו, והשנייה היא בעת שאנשים מתחברים זה לזה באיזה עניין של משא ומתן, למען הוציא איזה עסק לפועלו בכוח ידי כל המשתתפים בזה. וכן, התכלית העיקרית בזאת ההתחברות היא הוצאת העסק לאור. ההתחברות בעצמה היא רק אמצעי לזה. In other words, there are two kinds of unions between two people. One is a purpose for itself, that we really want to be together because we identify with one another, we have common values, we have common ideas. That's why we want to get together. But there are also other unions between people which is on a functional basis, as means to ends, as he calls it. What is the sense of means to ends? That in other words, we do business together. It's not that we share values. It's not that we share common character. It's not that we share common features. We just want to get to a certain purpose, and as means for that, we're in a union together. We make business together. And he says, my alliance with the Zionists is exactly that type, the second type. I don't share their values. I don't share their worldview. I don't share their character. I just want to make business. And we have never seen, says Rabbi Reines, that anyone would say that making business with a secular Jew is a problem. We're all the time still religious Jews making business with secular Jews, sometimes even really partners of the same business. So nobody is against that. Why be against a common business which is called Zionism? על אחת כמה וכמה, a fortiori, when we see that it's not just business, but it's also, אומר, the last line, he says, אם מצד עצם המפעל, אשר לא יוכל לצאת לאור בלי השתתפות החופשיים, אם מצד הפעולה המוסרית שיש לקוות ממנה לחופשיים בדת. Here it's not only that we have business, but we can also hope that it will influence the secularist Jews to get a little more of the Jewish identity into them. So, in other words, that will influence them to become more religious. So he says, even if it were just a matter of business, it's justified. We don't do things as אל תתחבר לרשע, the Mishnah from Pirkei Avot that I put as a first source here, אל תתחבר לרשע, meaning don't be in a value-oriented or character-oriented union with it, but do business with them, no problem. And when people in his time telling him, just a minute, Rabbi Reines, the Zionist idea is actually is an attempt to bring the redemption, to bring the Geulah, to bring the Messiah by human means, by means of natural endeavor, which is forbidden. Says Rabbi Reines, I'm a practical person. I'm not bringing the Messiah. What I want is just to do good for the Jews, not bringing the Messiah, not do anything on metaphysical, meta-historical level. He says here, לא נתבהר דבר אחד והוא, in source number 3, text number 3, והוא, אם יש רשות לבקש אמצעי העברה בטוחים, גם קודם שתבוא ההתערותא דלעילא. If there is a justification to ask for practical means of transferring the Jews, before comes the awakening from above, from God, to bring the Messiah. Which were promised by our prophets. And he says, אין כל ספק, כי לא לבד שיש לנו רשות, כי אם גם חובה רבה רובצת עלינו לנסות להיטיב את מצבנו, המורה מאוד על ידי אמצעים בטוחים וקשרים על פי חוקי היהדות, ושגם כי העברה אשר אליה מכוונת התנועה הציונית, איננה בשום אופן כללית, ובאופן היותר טוב יש רק לקוות להעביר חלק גדול מבני עמנו ציונה. מדוע לא נתעסק בדבר הזה? It says, first of all, there is if it's not a matter of messianic aspirations, but just do good for the Jewish people, it's not only that we're allowed to do that, we're obliged to do that. It's a duty to do the best for saving Jewish lives. Besides, he said, we don't even aspire to bring all the Jewish people to Eretz Israel. We just wish to bring a large part of the Jewish people, but not all of it. So it's not a Geulah, so it's not a redemption. It's just about making, promoting the Jewish interests. So Rabbi Reines is all about, and by the way, this was his character as well. He was a very practical person. His interests are practical, to do what is good for Jews and good for Judaism. Don't think metaphysically, don't think meta-historically. It's just about doing business and doing it the best we can to save Jewish life and promote Jewish interests. That's all. On the other hand comes Rabbi Kook. And by the way, at that time, in the beginning of the 20th century, Rabbi Kook was not an important figure at all. He was a young rabbi who came from Europe to Jaffa, in 1904. And when he came, by the way, I don't know how much it is really true, but there's at least some hearsay that the person who arranged his job as the rabbi of Jaffa, rabbi of Yafo and the colonies, was no other but the Chafetz Chaim, the very important rabbi of that period. I'm not sure it's true, but there is such a hearsay. Anyway, he comes to Yafo, and Yafo is Jaffa, yes, is I would say, the main city of the new Yishuv, of the new Eretz Israel, of the pioneers. And already in 1904, it's already the second Aliyah, which was much more radical, socialist, secularist. And Rabbi Kook comes to this job, and he looks around and goes to the colonies and sees secular Jews that really don't care about Shabbat, don't care about mitzvot atluyot ba'atz, don't care about mitzvot on the whole. But on the other hand, they're all imbued by very strong heat and love of Eretz Israel and endeavor for a Jewish people and aspirations to promote good things for the Jewish people and social justice and agriculture in the land of Israel. And he's in a certain conflict. So on the one hand, it's such a heated Jewish spirit. On the other hand, it's secular. So how can we explain that? And Rabbi Kook doesn't want to be simplistic and say it's against the Torah, so it's worth nothing. He sees that there's a Jewish fervor in this enterprise. And then he, because he has a Kabbalistic background, Rabbi Kook knows Kabbalah very well, he develops his theory. And his theory is a kind of adaptation of the Kabbalah to the condition or to the realities as he sees against his eyes. And here, I would like to, if you give me just a few minutes, I would like to go into Rabbi Kook's metaphysical worldview by which he explains the reality to himself and to others as well in his writings. Otherwise, if you want to ask about Rabbi Reines, that's maybe the time for that. But if not, I will go into Rabbi Kook because it's really profound. We have to understand. Any questions about Rabbi Reines? Forgot to ask you. Okay, so let's continue to Rabbi Kook.
רק שאלה אחת.
בבקשה.
עד כמה זה אמת שהנציב מוולוז'ין היה בעד התנועה של חובבי ציון?
כן, it's absolutely true. Nativ of Volozhin, the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva, was a supporter, a strong and openly supporter of the Chovevei Tzion movement. He passed away before Herzl. He died before Herzl, but he was a supporter of Chovevei Tzion. But when he heard about Chilulei Shabbat, yes, desecration of the Shabbat in the colonies of Chovevei Tzion, which only started, he said, if the new settling of Eretz Israel is not according to Torah mitzvot, it doesn't worth it. But he was on the other, but he still then said, but I'm still with them and I still support them because I do hope that it will get back into the Orthodox path. He was actually the most important figure in the Jewish religious world of that time that supported Chovevei Tzion. Was the most important rabbi.
I have a question too.
Yes, please.
I don't understand, well, I do understand about anti-Semitism and with Herzl, but I don't understand the motivation. If they're gonna assimilate in the long run, why not assimilate now and just become a Christian country? Why a Jewish state?
No, that was the two different stages in Herzl's thinking. In 1993, I think, 1893, he believed in assimilation and said, let's go all to convert. But then he went as a journalist to France and saw the Dreyfus affair and saw the hatred to the Jews. And he said, they will not get us anyway. And we won't be intermingled with them anyway. And then he came upon the idea, he said, so at least he came upon the idea, if we can get into assimilate into the Gentile nations, we have to make a state of ourselves. And that was the second stage. It was no longer a means for assimilation, the other way around. It came as a means to counter assimilation. And from that point and on, Zionism was fighting assimilation and assimilant Jews as well. So let's get back to Rabbi Kook. And here, I need your concentration.
סליחה, רבני.
בבקשה.
המסך שלך לא הלך. You didn't show well the...
Okay, sure. No, yes, sure. So let's get share screen. Here it is. Okay, we get it? Yes. We get it? See the text?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Better now?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. So, but before we get to of Kook's text, I would like to make a short introduction about his theology, which is really very interesting. Rabbi Kook says, let's leave the text for now. Rabbi Kook says like this: we all know that there are good things in the world, right? If someone gives tzedakah, it's good. If someone helps another person, it's good. If people, of course, they have religious sentiment, it's good. Many things in our world are good. Okay, that's a simple things to say. Simple thing to say. But if you collect all the goods together, all the good things together, you get the entire good, the whole good of the world. Now, here it says Rabbi Kook, if you get the whole good of the world together, it's not just a sum of all the good things into one, but there is beyond that. If you get the complete good, the perfect good, it's much more than all its parts. It's not only the summation of all its parts, it's more than that. So we have a kind of thing that we can call the perfect good. And here says Rabbi Kook, the perfect good is infinite. Our world is finite. So the perfect good cannot get into our world in its wholeness, in its entirety. The perfect good enters our world in parts, in limited parts. And so he says that in our world, we always see a partial good, only part of the perfect good. So we see a certain person that goes and do that good, another person who do another good thing. This person is good in his wisdom. This person is good in his charity. We never see the entire good in one piece, in one person, in one deed. Our world can get only limited goods. Now, says Rabbi Kook, metaphysically, because everyone takes only one part of the good and he sees his friend and says, this is not the good. What I think is the good, that is the good. These partial goods have to fight with one another. But Rabbi Kook says, they all aspire to get the same perfect good. I take one part, you take another part. I see your part is bad, you see my part is bad, and so we fight. But basically, we're both good, so we both aspire to the perfect good. And so, says Rabbi Kook, history is about synthesis. We fight each other, but from this fight, there comes a synthesis, that takes from my good, and from your good. My synthesis, one synthesis becomes the ideology of the next stage. And another synthesis comes against it, and they also fight, which is also a partial good with another partial good, but then comes a higher synthesis. And so, says Rabbi Kook, history goes from one synthesis to another to higher synthesis until in the infinite future, the entire synthesis will come, and then the perfect good can prevail, or at least we can come closer and closer to that. As Professor Yosef Ben Shlomo said once, yes, Rabbi Kook does not believe in Shlemut. In Rabbi Kook, the main idea is not Shlemut, perfection, but Hishtalmut, the process of perfection, the process of moving toward perfection. That's the most important thing for you. And it's even, let's think about it even in a more, I would say, a little more original way. If something is a given perfection, it's given, it's static. But if we're all the time in this process of moving toward perfection, we're all the time growing. There is something good in the process. It's all the time improving. So Rabbi Kook says that the entire history, at least of the Jewish people, is moving toward perfection. So according to that, he looks at the situation in the Jewish people of his time and is asking himself, what is it all about? According to this metaphysical worldview, and this metaphysical worldview, by the way, is really a kind of transformation of the Kabbalistic worldview that Rabbi Kook absorbed in his youth. Actually, it's the idea of infinite good is the idea of infinite God in some words. And by the way, I can give you a very nice anecdote about that in a moment. So actually, what is the struggle, the fight within the Jewish people of the early 20th century says? On the one hand, we see the secularists, but the secularists, what are they about? Social justice, returning to Eretz Israel, renewing Judaism, forming a new Jew. What is the idea of a new Jew of the second Aliyah Zionist? Who cares about agriculture, who cares about social justice, who cares about the physical shape of the Jewish person, not a diaspora Jew that is all the time sitting in the synagogue and the Bet Midrash and makes pilpulim on the Talmud, but living the life in nature, living the life in sports, living life in shaping a new body. Can I say, says Rabbi Kook, that he is bad, that he's just an evil person because he doesn't follow the Torah? There are many good things in that as well. But on the other hand, Rabbi Kook goes to the Orthodox neighborhood, Haredi neighborhoods of Jerusalem. And he sees people praying, and he sees people sitting on the Talmud and dedicating their lives to learning Torah and living in poverty, poor people, because they want to live only just for really spiritual life. He's asking themselves, is that bad? Are they bad people, evil people? Chas v'chalila. They're the most religious, the deepest people in the world. So we have good people here and good people there, and they're both fighting each other. So how can we explain that? According to Rabbi Kook's metaphysics, the explanation is understandable. This is one part of the perfect good, and this is the other part of the perfect good. And partial goods are always limited, and they always see the other parties as negative, as evil, and that's why they have to fight, to struggle. But then the second stage, the next stage, will be the synthesis that will bring together some parts of this and some part of that, and will combine them to one. And if that synthesis will not be enough, it will fight against another synthesis. And then in the third generation, we'll get closer and closer to the perfect, to the perfect good. But let's ask ourselves now, let's return to this metaphysics and ask, what is the perfect good? The perfect good is actually God. The infinite, the term Ein Sof in Kabbalah is the uppermost transcendent aspect of God. So what comes out of this idea is that actually we are all aspiring to God. We all want to reach God. The perfect good is God. What comes out of it, if we go another step, is that even the most secularist, atheist, communist Jews that came to Eretz Israel, socialist, I'm not sure what call, they say that they don't believe in God, actually they aspire to God, but they don't call it God. Now, and here comes the anecdote that I promised you. There's a story about a pioneer, secularist pioneer, that comes to Rabbi Kook. And Rabbi Kook tells him, it's important to keep Shabbat, it's important to keep mitzvot, it's part of our Jewish identities, and this and that. So this secular Jew answers him, Rabbi, this is all very nice what you're telling me, but the problem is that I don't believe in God. What did Rabbi Kook answer him? The God that you don't believe in which you don't believe, I don't believe either. That was his answer. The God that you disbelieve, I, Rabbi Kook, also disbelieve. In what sense? If you take God as this, personal figure, the old man that gives present to the good and gives punishment to the bad, and it's just about, looking at those petty things, you did that and didn't do that. This is not God that I can accept either as Rabbi Kook. My God is the perfect good, and to that God you also wish to come closer. Your aspiration is to do that good. And as every aspiration to do good, especially to do good for the Jewish people, is aspiring to God, is aspiring to get closer to God. Even if you don't call it God, you call it good, the perfect good is God. That's a very brilliant idea, I would say, by Rabbi Kook, on Rabbi Kook's part. And due to that, he's asking himself, so what is the historical role of secularist Zionism in our time? And he answers, yes, the Orthodox Judaism, or in other words, the diaspora, the exile Judaism, exilic Judaism, has become too much concentrated on spiritual things. And it became detached from life, detached from nature. And what the Zionists want to do is do the antithesis, the other way, the polar opposite to that. But the synthesis will be the combination of this spiritual endeavor of the Orthodox and the physical, nationalist, earthly endeavor of the secularists. And then Judaism will become something that is relevant not only to Bet Midrash and synagogue, but to life as well. That's the synthesis that Rabbi Kook was aspiring to. And that was why he was very much in favor of agriculture, and even in favor of military force, and even in favor of sports in his time, because he saw it as a return of Judaism to all the spheres of life, not only to the sphere of Bet Midrash and Bet Knesset. And when he came to describe the people of the second Aliyah, this is a very, very powerful text. He said, and here I'm reading it, Neshamot shel olam hatohu. This is a Kabbalistic term as well. הרשעים, בעלי הפרינציפים, the evil ones, the wicked ones, yes, the secularists that have principles, the ideological ones, הפושעים להכעיס ולא לתיאבון. הפושעים להכעיס, yes, the sinners, להכעיס, the ideological sinners, not the one who just go according, because they have desires, but they do it out of ideology, נשמתם גבוהה מאוד, ואורות בתוהו. Their soul is very lofty, their soul is very sublime. It is taken from the lights of Tohu. And here it's a term from the Ari, from Kabbalat Ari, the Kabbalah of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Ari, who said that before the creation of the world, there were lights of Tohu that were so strong that God wanted to create the world by the first creation. He made the first creation, that the lights that he took from him out to create the world was so strong that the vessels that were supposed to contain them couldn't contain them. They were so strong that they broke down. The same lights, says that by Kook, are the lights of those criminals, he calls them, or wicked Jews, yes, sinners. They are so strong in their force of activity and force of creation that the limited vessels of our world cannot hold them, cannot really bear them. And bacharu beheres, and they chose ruin, and they're ruining. העולם מתשתש על ידם, והם עמו, the world gets shattered by them, and they go with it together. It means that it doesn't have a form, yes, it loses its form. אבל תמצית האומץ שיש ברצונם, the extract of the courage that they have, היא הנקודה של קודש. It comes from a point of holiness. Even if they're secular, it comes from a point of holiness, because they aspire to the Holy of Holies, which is the perfect good. נספגת על הנשמות המושעות בהמערכה. That's why he said, בעתותי גאולה, he reads the Mishnah that says that before the redemption, that the great chutzpah, insolence. What's that insolence? And the shamot alohatot, the avid, the fervent souls that will go to ruin everything, nothing can stop them. That's the chutzpah, that's the insolence of the time before Messiah comes. And we need that insolence. We need that insolence, because otherwise diaspora or exilic Judaism would not be shaken, would remain in the synagogue, would remain in Batei Midrash. This shakes it and brings it back to life with all its force. Even if the Orthodox are against it, at the end of the day, they will get absorbed into that, and will combine into that into a new Judaism, which will combine both this vividity and this spirituality of exilic Judaism. So he identifies with the idea of shlilat galut, which is called the negation of exilic Judaism. He identified with that exilic Judaism is about to end. It's not. It finished its historical role, because it was for the time of the exile, and now we return to Eretz Israel. Returning to Eretz Israel is not just about returning to the land, but also returning to life, returning to natural life, returning to a life in which the Torah can be applicable to all the spheres of life, and not just to spiritual fields. That's Rabbi Kook. Now, let's compare Rabbi Kook to Rabbi Reines. Reines, practical, good for Jews, good for Judaism. Rabbi Kook, it's an entire metaphysical, meta-historical process. It's the renewal of Judaism in a different sense, altogether different sense. It's a actual aspiration to a lofty sphere or lofty level of deity, of God himself. That happens here. It's a redemptional process, not just a process of caring for Jewish interests. It's absolutely different point of view perspective. from that of Rabbi Reines. So there, questions about?
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
By who was Rav Kook most influenced, or who were the people that most influenced Rav Kook?
First of all, it's a good question. It's a good question. He had many enemies in the old Yeshuv, Orthodox Haredim, who were against him and called him Epicurus for such. And he had some friends in the secularist Yeshuv. The famous author of that time, Yosef Chaim Brenner, was his friend in Yafo. But most of his followers were what we call religious Zionists, that followers of the Mizrahi, although he himself was not a member of the Mizrahi. Followers of the Mizrahi, which is, Rabbi Reines' faction, were his adherents, were his followers, but he himself was not a member of the Mizrahi, but of Agudat Israel, of which I will speak in a second.
But my question was, who influenced Rav Kook on his ideas? Where he took all of his ideas?
His ideas were...
His rabbi.
His teacher was the Natziv, the one that Rabbi Mordechai was mentioned a few minutes ago. Natziv was the head of the yeshiva of Volozhin, in which Rabbi Kook actually spent less than a year, but this was one of his teachers. By the way, the Natziv didn't have much Kabbalistic knowledge. His Kabbalistic knowledge he gained from other sources, which we don't probably know.
I have a question. Is it true that Rabbi Kook said that Herzl could have been the Mashiach ben Yosef?
Yes, actually, it's one of the stranger sermons that Rabbi Kook gave. When Herzl passed away in 1904, Rabbi Kook just arrived to Eretz Israel, and he had to make a eulogy, a hesped for Herzl. Now, on the one hand, it's an important figure. On the other hand, Herzl was a secular Jew that desecrated the Shabbat, and it's forbidden according to Halakha to eulogize him, to say a hesped about him. So Rabbi Kook actually gave a whole sermon, not mentioning the name of Herzl even once, but referring to Herzl as a kind of Mashiach ben Yosef. Not exactly him, the person as Mashiach ben Yosef, but the phenomenon of political Zionism as a kind of symbolizing or manifesting Mashiach ben Yosef in our time. He said, actually, there's Mashiach ben Yosef who has to make the effort on the earthly level, on the terrestrial level, and there's Mashiach ben David who has to complete the process in the spiritual level. And Herzl did his job. He didn't mention Herzl, but there's a first stage that was done in the political earthly level, and this paves the way to the second stage, which is Mashiach ben David, which will complete it on the spiritual level. And of course, he meant Herzl without calling him by his name.
רוב הרבנים החרדים לא הלכו עם התנועה המזרחית?
נכון. Already in 1902, when the Mizrahi was founded, it's important to say that many of the supporters of the Zionist movement were Orthodox Jews, simple Orthodox Jews. But from the rabbinic elite, there were very, very few, if any, rabbis who supported Zionism. Most of the constituency of the Zionist movement was religious, but the rabbis, most of them did not support it. Don't say the rabbis. Many rabbis also supported it, but the prominent rabbis, the first-line rabbis, did not support it.
הם הבנים שמחה, איך קוראים לו? רב
טייכטל, רבי טייכטל, כן.
הוא היה באמת חשוב, הוא כן ספורט.
First of all, in his time, it was not so important. Second, he started off his way as a very anti-Zionist rabbi, a Hungarian rabbi, and only as a result of the Holocaust in the 1940s, he changed his mind. And also, once again, he's a second-line rabbi, third-line rabbi. He's not a first-line rabbi. Not even also the Admorim, the Hasidic rabbis, were not supportive of Zionism, except for the Ruzhin house, the Ruzhin dynasty. There you could find a few supportive rabbis of Zionism. Okay,
I have another question.
Yes.
Thank you. What do you think Rav Kook would think about the reality of the state of Israel today. What about this vision that wants to mix the religious view with the secular view of the Jewish population? That in the recent years and decades, it shows that that mix is almost impossible, and even if it's conflictable.
Okay, so this is already brings us closer to actual questions. Rabbi Kook, I don't know what he would say, but his followers are very different about this question. Some of them say that this is actually another step toward the perfection of the, we have to wait, we have to be patient. The perfection is growing step by step, and it is still not the ideal, but coming closer to that. Others would say that Rabbi Kook would be disappointed. Why? Because there is a famous text in which it says, an ordinary state is not a human ideal because it's just like a company. It's just like a business. It doesn't have a religious value in its foundation. But our state, the state of Israel, and by the way, he's one of the first people who used the term state of Israel, not Jewish state, state of Israel. He says, this is a divine state. This is Yesod Kisei Hashem Ba'olam, the foundation of God's throne in the world. All its purpose, is to make the presence of God in our world, Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad. And this, of course, is not the state of Israel as we see it today. I'm not sure what he would say, but at least his son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda, said, this is the state that my father was dreaming about, but not in its complete form. We're moving toward it, but it's on the way. And my father was sure that it's not in one piece, step by step, and we'll get there as soon as God will help us. But we have to move forward, and here I would like to go to the camp of the opposers of Zionism. Now, there are many opposers of Zionism. Here too, we have Kabbalistic reasons and practical reasons. And you'll be maybe surprised to see that, to learn that one of the main opposers of Zionism from Kabbalistic reasons, also from practical reasons, was the Rebbe of Lubavitch of that time. Not the Rebbe of Lubavitch whom you know, Menachem Edelstein also, but 2 generations before him, Sholem Ber Schneerson, who said that one of the reasons he is against Zionism is, hold your breath, because it's messianic, and it's bad to be messianic before the Messiah comes. Lubavitcher Rebbe says that it's bad to be lidchok et haketz, to push on redemption, as he says. What does this idea also goes to? Of course, Chabad is the most pushing on redemption that we know, but not in his time. Anyway, the idea that comes to the more kind of, not Kabbalistic, but kind of metaphysical idea that the radical opposers of Zionism, Hungarian, Galician rabbis that go against Zionism, is, as you said, based on the midrash of Agadah of Shira, three oaths that God made to the people of Israel. And to understand that, we have to go to first Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, and then to the Gemara in Masechet Ketubot. Now, in Shir HaShirim, there's a verse, השבעתי אתכם בנות ירושלים בצבאות או באיילות השדה, אם תאירו ואם תעוררו את האהבה עד שתחפץ. I'll translate it. I adjured you, the daughters of Jerusalem, or the girls of Jerusalem, בצבאות או באיילות השדה, a little strange, I adjured you, make you swear, yes? בצבאות או באיילות השדה, in the gazelles and antelopes of the field, אם תאירו ואם תעוררו את האהבה עד שתחפץ. If you awake or reawake the love until it wills to come by itself. Don't awake the love until it comes by itself, until it wills. What's the meaning of this verse? Now, Chazal, as we know, always interpreted Shir HaShirim as a song of love, not just between the man and the woman, but between God and the people of Israel. So they explained, what is the love between God and the people of Israel? It's the Geulah, it's the redemption. So what is the verse about? God adjures the people of Israel not to awake the love, not to awake redemption until it wills, until it comes by itself, on time. Mitzvot Ba'alot HaSadeh is an interesting question. What does it mean? But let's leave it for now. And why does it appear 3 times? The Gemara says that it were 3 oaths, 3 places in which God adjured the people of Israel, and the Goyim as well. We'll see. ההוא מבא ילד לרבי יוסי ברבי חנינא דאמר 3 שבועות הללו למה? Why 3 oaths? אחת שלא יעלו ישראל בחומה, ואחת שהשביע הקדוש ברוך הוא את ישראל שלא ימרדו באומות העולם, ואחת שהשביע הקדוש ברוך הוא את עובדי כוכבים שלא ישתעבדו בהם בישראל יותר מדי. Meaning that when Israel went to exile, God made them swear 3 oaths. 1, לא לעלות בחומה, not go surmount the walls in one mass. According to Rashi, it's kachoma. It's one of the versions, kachoma, like a wall, in one piece, go to Eretz Israel. The other, לא למרוד באומות העולם, not to revolt against the Gentiles, against the nations of the world, accept their rule in exile. ואחת שהשביע הקדוש ברוך הוא את עובדי כוכבים, God drew also the Gentiles, the Goyim, that will not really abuse Israel too much. And now, what is בצבאות ובעלות השדה? What is this? I adjured you by the gazelles and the antelopes of the field. Says רבי אלעזר, אמר להם הקדוש ברוך הוא לישראל, אם אתם מקיימים את השבוע מוטב, ואם לאו, אני מתיר את בשרכם כצבאות וחיילות השדה. If you follow my oaths, that's good. And if you don't, if you break this oath, אני מתיר את בשרכם, I release your flesh. Yes, I actually make your flesh free to all the world as the gazelles and antelopes of the field, meaning that your blood is free. Your blood is allowed to everyone. I allow everyone to hit you. This is a very harsh punishment, but the rabbis and rabbis who took this Gemara, and it also has some parallels in the Midrash, say the message here to accept the yoke of exile, of galut, passively. לא לעלות כחומה, not to go to Israel in one mass, לא למרוד באומות העולם, not to revolt against the nations. Also, the nations should not abuse us too much, but if not, the punishment is dreadful. אני מתיר את בשרכם, I allow your blood. And under this midrash, it's a little, the scribblings are not helpful. Under this, by the way, this passage from the Gemara is before two other passages, before and after. Is that okay? Before and after this text, the Gemara praises the settling of Eretz Israel, Yishuv Eretz Israel, that it's good to be in Eretz Israel more than in another agenda.
¿Se pueden apagar los micrófonos?
Can you mute okay. It's better to live in Eretz Israel in a Gentile city than live abroad in a Jewish city, and things like that. And Eretz Israel is even someone who walks a few meters in Eretz Israel gained his Olam Haba, and things like that. And someone who lives in the Chutz La'aretz is like someone who doesn't have God. Very strong things in favor of Aliyah Eretz Israel, but here this piece says that don't go to Eretz Israel in one piece, don't in one mass, don't go in Eretz Israel in a way that will actually mean that you want to bring the Geulah by yourselves. And the Hasidic thinkers who, mainly Hasidic or the radical Orthodox thinkers who use this midrash say that the Zionist movement actually wants to do exactly that. And the main leader of radical Orthodoxy in that time was the Rebbe of Munkach, Chaim Elazar Shapira. And before I go to his text, I know that we don't have much time, but I really have to show you a nice little piece about that. Rebbe of Munkach, there is you can see him from a movie, a short film from 1933, the wedding of his only daughter, and journalists took a film of this wedding. Can you see that? You see
you're
that?
not sharing.
Okay, look at the wedding, mass wedding, and the policemen push the audience. You can see that men and women are not so separated in this Orthodox event. And here's the
You're not seeing it.
Here's the Munkachi.
לא רואים.
You're not
He
seeing
gives
it.
a message to the Jews of America. You'll see him speaking in a moment.
We can't see, we can't see.
אנחנו
Can
לא-
see? You can't see?
Nothing.
לא, לא.
Nothing.
Okay, I'll try again. Okay. Now?
כן. כן.
Okay. Okay, that's the Munkach Rebbe. That's the Rebbe of Munkach. You got a glimpse of him. I want to say to our brethren in America, keep Shabbos. Shabbos is important. No other way but keep Shabbos. Okay, very fervent, you see. And he says, and let's now go to the text. He says, הנה נבוא לדברי זקן הראשונים אשר מפיהם אנחנו, okay, he gives a few sources. I won't read them here. He says that even if all the Gentiles agree, even if there is a consent and all the Jews agree, we may not go to Eretz Israel because we never know that the end, meaning the redemption, comes until it really comes. Maybe it's a temporary will of God and we don't have to use that temporary will because the verse says, until it wills, until the true Geula comes, and by then we can go to the Eretz Israel. Until then, never ever, and therefore the Zionist movement for him is a movement, is a satanic movement of actually going to Eretz Israel in a time that is not due, and the Chilonim, the secularists, go to Eretz Israel to defile it, to make it impure. He believes that it's also an apocalyptic era, but the apocalyptic era because in Eretz Israel, the holiest place on earth, we can go see the Zionists on the one side, secularists, and the Haredim on the other side. It's like you see metaphysical forces of the greatest Dusha, the greatest holiness, and the greatest Tumah, the greatest impurity fighting together. He believes that Messiah is about to come, but still not there. We're not yet there. And in this stage, we have to strengthen the Haredim in Eretz Israel more than any other forces to oppose the Zionists, to stop the Zionists, because otherwise we'll have to wait very long until the redemption comes. He came to Eretz Israel in 1930 and met a Sephardi rabbi by the name of Chacham al-Fandari, in which he believed that Chacham al-Fandari could bring the Messiah truly with spiritual forces. But Chacham al-Fandari passed away during that visit at the age of 100 and something, and of course didn't bring the Messiah. He returned to Europe and very, very excited from his visit in Eretz Israel, 13 days, but believed that the greatest means to bring the Messiah is to fight the Zionists and not let them achieve their goals. His ideas were later adopted by the Rebbe of Satmar after the State of Israel. And Rabbi of Satmar said, because of the Zionists, the Zionist movement, we also got the punishment. God allowed our blood, like the antelopes and the gazelles of the field, and that was the Holocaust, according to the Rebbe of Satmar. But the Rebbe of Munkach passed away before the Holocaust, but the Rebbe of Satmar, as kind of follower of his doctrine, said that the Holocaust is the result.
סליחה, אבל זה יהיה לפני כן. ההולוקאוסט זה לפני מדינת ישראל. והפוך, אחד מהשלושה שבועות, שלא ילמדו, איך אומרים, שלא ירדו יותר מדי ביהודים, אולי לא קיימו את השבוע הזאת.
Okay, that's one of the answers of the religious Zionists. The religious Zionists said there are many answers. One of them is that the oaths are only for 1,000 years, and then when the Goyim agree, it's not irrelevant. Also, there is another answer that the Goyim didn't play their part, and they did abuse the Jews too much. But according to the chronology, I want to say once again, the Rebbe of Munkach wrote this before the Holocaust and doesn't refer to the punishment. and then was the Holocaust, and then was the State of Israel. And after the State of Israel was founded, the Rebbe of Satmar, not the Rebbe of Munkach, the Rebbe of Satmar, another Rebbe, said that the punishment did come, and the punishment for the sin of Zionism was the Holocaust. And this is really the ideology that furnishes today, that nourishes the radical Haredim of Satmar, the Turei Karta, Toldot Aaron, and other factions of radical Haredism in Israel.
אבל לא הבנתי, בגלל שמדינת ישראל היה אחרי ההולוקאוסט, אז איך מסבירים שבגלל מדינת ישראל היה...
Zionist movement, the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was the endeavor to go against the oaths, was to send Jews to Eretz Israel in one mass and to rebel against the nations of the world. למרוד באומות העולם ולעלות כחומה. That was enough, and the Holocaust came as a result. So say, okay, so what about the State of Israel? And later on, מלחמת ששת הימים, the Six-Day War, the Rebbe of Satmar says this is all trials by the Satan, by the devil. It's actually a vision, which is a mirage, a false vision, an illusion that the Sitra Achra shows to the people of Israel in order to test them, in order to put them in trial. And see how faithful they remain after those trials. But now I really have to go to the fourth. Now, so we see that the Munkach Rebbe and the Satmar Rebbe go to metaphysical reasonings and justifications to their anti-Zionism. But now we go to Agudat Israel, that was founded, as I said, short after the Zionist movement was founded, there was Agudat Israel. Rabbi Kook even joined Agudat Israel. Agudat Israel was not at the beginning, not clearly anti-Zionist, but non-Zionist. And their idea was really to promote Jewish the interests of Judaism in Europe and the rest of the world. But some of its founders really saw Agudat Israel as an alternative to Judaism, as to some degree even anti-Zionist. I won't get into all the ideologues. The main figures, the important figures, the rabbinic figures that supported Agudat Israel were the Chafetz Chaim and the Rebbe of Gur of that time. But the most interesting thinker of Agudat Israel, ideologue of Agudat Israel, was Yitzchak Breuer. Yitzchak Breuer was a grandson of Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, whom we studied 2 weeks ago. But he, unlike Rabbi Hirsch, he took a nationalist standpoint, and I want to emphasize this. He was anti-Zionist, Yitzchak Breuer, anti-Zionist, but still defined himself as a nationalist Jew. So how can he be a nationalist Jew but anti-Zionist? He was a Haredi, Orthodox a nationalist, and actually his idea of nationalism was quite different. He wrote this in a few texts starting from the early 20th century, in which he said, and later on he defined it even more succinctly in his later books. And he says, exactly as we started our talk today, and this is a kind of, finishing the circle. He says, what is a nation? So we agreed, we spoke about it an hour and something ago. A nation is a group of people united by one territory, one language, one popular culture, one race, and a common history. And if we look at the Jewish people, says Yitzchak Breuer, frankly, in the last 2,000 years, how much of it do we have? We don't have one territory, we don't have one language, we don't have one popular culture, Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, different foods, different clothing. We don't have one race, they look differently. Not even Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, but even Ashkenazim among themselves. Eastern Europe is not the same as Western Europe. And even in Eastern Europe, by the way, they're not the same in Western Europe. And even the Sfaradim, Teimanim are not the same as the Irakim, and they're not the same as Moroccans. They're not, so common history, we're all in exile, but when those exiles are diasporas are flourishing, the other ones are suffering, and the other way around. So we don't even hardly ever have the same history. So are we not one people? Once again, Boaz says, we are one people. We see ourselves as one people. The Goyim see us as one people. So does the model not work? Isn't it the right model? No, the model works. this five pattern model works for all the nations, but the Jewish nation is an exception. Why is that is it an exception? Because he says, well, in all the histories of other nations, all nationalities of other nations, we see that when there is a nation formed by race, territory, language, culture, etc., history, that nation receives a state, sovereign state. And when they receive a state, they also make a law. They really legislate their laws. In the Jewish people, it's different. It's the opposite way. The Jewish people, in the Jewish case, it's not that the people created the law, but the law created the people. And he says, if you see in the Torah, Hayom hazeh niyeta le'am, this day you became a people, God says to the people of Israel, before they come to Eretz Israel, before they have a nation, before a state, before they have a territory, before they have all the features of a normal people. Why? Because it's the alliance, the brit of the Torah. And the Torah is not just a religious thing. It's the law of the Jewish people. It's a formative law. It's a law that by which the Jewish people was defined. Ha'am HaYehudi, he says, Am HaTorah, the nation of the Torah. Now, he says, because of that, by the way, he says that the Reform are wrong. Reform want to change the law. Reform can change the law, because changing the law is actually something that you can do if you created the law. But here, it's not that you created the law. It's not that the nation created the law. The law created the nation, so the nation can't change it. He says, under this definition of the Am HaTorah, I come to the Gentiles, to the nations of the world, and say, yes, we deserve a state, because we're a nation. But the nation is Am HaTorah, and therefore the state should be Medinat HaTorah, the state of the Torah. And he comes to the nations of the world and said, Atzarat Balfour, the Balfour Declaration says, Bait Leumi La'am HaYehudi, national home for the Jewish people. We are the Jewish people. We are the Orthodox. But at the same time, his party, Agudat Israel, does not support him because they don't want a Jewish state, or they don't, at least not fight for Jewish state. So Breuer is a kind of lonely cavalier, lonely fighter for his ideology without many divisions behind him. But his ideology is very clear, and because of that ideology, he comes to the Zionist movement with great criticism. He says, actually, what does the Zionist movement want to do? The Zionist movement wants to create a Jewish nation on the secular basis, on the basis of territory, Eretz Israel, language, the renewal of the Hebrew language, race, mizug galuyot, common race, yes, a melting pot, culture, once again, mizug galuyot in the cultural level, and creating a new history of a new Jew in Eretz Israel. But, says Yitzhak Breuer, listen to what we're saying. You said a new basis for identity, national identity. This means actually a new nation. There will be the Jews who will remain with the old Jewish identity based on Torah nation, Am HaTorah, and there becomes a new nation that is based on the 5 elements of territory, language, race, culture, and history. So actually the disaster in the Zionist movement, says Yitzhak Breuer, is that it creates 2 nations. It separates the Jewish people into 2 nations. And in the speech from 1936, he says, "Hasha'ah doreshet beirut. Ha'am Habayit Halaumi kam vayeh." We are about to have a national home already then. Amei HaMa'arav iftichu le'am Yisrael. The nations promised it to Am Yisrael. And ואני שואל, לאיזה עם? Which nation of Jewish people? לעתיק או החדש? The ancient one or the new one? הבית הלאומי עומד לכונן את עצמו להתחיל בכינון הקהילות. אני שואל, אילו קהילות? העתיקות או החדשות? Which communities? And Breuer is very analytical and very sharp. Many, 2 generations later, a few decades later, his nephew, Yitzhak Breuer's nephew, Rabbi Mordechai Breuer, asks himself, wrote an article asking, Yitzhak Breuer's analysis was so strong, so compelling. So why didn't we become in Eretz Israel 2 nations? We have many struggles. We want to eat each other. We fight each other all the time. דת ומדינה, religion and state, חילונים ודתיים, but still we remain one nation. Let's be honest about it. Even we often are very alienated to one another, we're still one nation. How did it become? And Rabbi Mordechai Boyer says on that issue, we remained one nation because probably Yitzchak Boyer was wrong. We're not Am Torah, we're Am Sgula. And Sgula is something really that is beyond any definition. And probably Rabbi Kook was more right than Yitzchak Boyer that this Sgula, this supernatural trait, characteristic, hold us together, even if rationally we should have become, we are supposed to become two nations. And so when the state of Israel is founded after the Holocaust and after, and after a 3 more years of really blocking the Aliyah to Eretz Israel, after the United Nations acknowledged the right of Israel to exist, and they actually acknowledged 2 states, Arab state and Jewish state, but the Arabs rejected the partition resolution 181. The Jewish state was established in, as you know, in 1946, and indeed, the great Zionist victory, triumphant Zionist victory, but Orthodoxy was a part of that Jewish state. And since then, actually, yes, Orthodoxy was remained in 2 factions, one pro-state, the other not anti-state, but not non-Zionist and Zionist. And what happened, and in that I would like to finish, what happened in the state of Israel is that Haredi Judaism, the non-Zionist Orthodoxy, went more and more to the side of really reshaping or re-establishing the Torah world that was destroyed in the Holocaust, and took all its energies to rebuilding the Torah world in Eretz Israel, while religious Zionism took all its energies to getting integrated into the Zionist project, into the Israeli society, into the new state that was now established, and they were so enthusiastic about it. Actually, in the first few years, the Haredim were also quite enthusiastic, but they cooled down back. The more things developed, they returned to their more reserved position. And the outcome was that during the 1950s and 1960s, these 2 ideologies were not just differing ideologies within one orthodoxy, but actually became 2 orthodoxies. And in Israel of today, I know that in Chutz La'aretz it's not that strong, but in Israel of today, actually, there are 2 orthodoxies. It's not just being in controversy regarding yes Zionism, no Zionism, yes state, yes Israel, state of Israel, no state of Israel, but it's much more about ways of life. It's different clothing, different language, different Torah institutions, different neighborhoods. Haredim are in separate neighborhoods. Zionist religious Jews are in integrated neighborhood. Different newspapers, different rabbis, different Torah sources, different halacha, different clothing, everything is different. And the most, maybe the most powerful test to show that it's actually not a controversy within one orthodoxy, but 2 orthodoxies, 2 religious movements, is the test that were given to us by Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. That the Braita says that even though there are differences in so many important things, לא נמנעו בית שמאי לשאת נשים מבית הלל, ובית הלל נשים מבית שמאי. They married one another. And in Israel of today, it's sad to say that ציונים דתיים ציונים and חרדים, religious Zionists and חרדים do not marry each other, do not have common marriages. And so actually it became that the ideological dispute was dafka when the state of Israel became a fact, was no longer a matter of ideology or political dispute, but a matter of really different ways of life and different religious movements that live with us until today. But changes here and changes there make both of this movement much more lively and much more variegated, much more complex than it seems from the outside separation, because there is a really rich variety in each one of them that in some aspects will bring them together, even though they exist in separation. So that's actually the outcome of the dispute on Zionism. This is where we can finish, but I'm staying here for your questions and for the rest of you who will leave us, I will say להתראות בפעם הבאה. See you next week in our last lesson, in our last class. If anyone wants to ask me questions, I'm here. Good evening. Yes. Any questions? Comments?
רק רוצה להגיד לך תודה, שכל הכבוד, באמת היה מאוד מאוד מרשים. באמת תודה רבה.
תודה רבה, תודה לכם.
אני גם רוצה להודות לך, בני, ורוצה לשאול שאלה. אתה יודע משהו על הגישה של החכמים הספרדים כלפי הציונות?
כן. אז כן, זו שאלה חשובה, נדבר עליה בשיעור הבא. השיעור הבא מוקדש יותר לספרדים, אבל אני רוצה להגיד כבר עכשיו כמה מילים. A few words already now. The Sephardi rabbi, but can you do the noises? The Sephardi rabbis, okay?
חכם הפגס הוא חייתה. Yeah, yes.
Okay. The Sephardi rabbis were basically very positive of Zionism, as long as Zionism was working in their countries as a national movement to return to Eretz Israel, and most of the Zionists in the Arab countries were not secularists, at least not very strong secularists, and actually many of the promoters of Zionism in the Arab countries, in the Islamic countries, were rabbis. So it worked very well together. When and where do we see Sephardi rabbis that object Zionism, oppose Zionism? Of course, here in Eretz Israel. When they come to Eretz Israel and see that the Zionists work as a secular movement and secularize the Jewish people here and promote secularism, then starts what we can call Haredi Sephardi movement. First of all, it's Porat Yosef in 1921, but even before that, we can see not just Orthodox Haredi rabbis that goes against Zionism, but even radical Orthodox rabbis. One of them, we might have not known, but Sdei Chemed is anti-Zionist. Rabbi Mutzafi is anti-Zionist. Chacham Alfandari is anti-Zionist. Many less-known rabbis are also anti-Zionist. Some of them are really stark, strong, tough anti-Zionists, and they even try to form a Dah Haredit Sfaradit, which is a kind of an umbrella organization of the anti-Zionist groups. They don't succeed very much. The Haredim, I'll speak about in the next class, they don't succeed very much, but later on, when the great Aliyot come after the State of Israel, then the Haredim recruit young Sephardi young men into the Shivot, and then there comes the second wave of Haredi Sfaradism. We'll talk about next class. Yes. Other questions or comments?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, please.
We see on the Rishonim that they yearn for going to Eretz Israel to live. We see a yearning to go and live there, and it doesn't seem to be any issue. So the opposers of going to Israel, of Zionism that you talk, they oppose the movement and not living there itself, or what was their idea in respect with the Rishonim that proves that message?
Yes, okay, so there's not such a consensus among the Rishonim. There's a controversy among the Rishonim as well, whether or not we have Yitzat Yeshuv Eretz Israel today. For example, the Tosfot brings two reasons. The Tosfot, in that Gemara in Ketubot, where we see that the Gemara says it's important to live in the land of Israel, and whoever doesn't live in is like someone who doesn't have a God, etc., etc. So Tosfot is asking, so okay, so why don't we all go to Eretz Israel? And there are two answers there. One answer is, I would say, a little strange, so to speak. They said there are mitzvot atluyot ba'aretz, mitzvot dependent on the land, which were not really, since we live in the exile, we can't know how to fulfill them. So if we don't know how to fulfill them, we can be really sinners in the land of Israel. So let's not put ourselves into trial and stay here. The other reason is sakanat drachim. It's difficult to go to Eretz Israel because, you know, the robbers and dangers on the way, and we can't really risk our lives for that. Now, of course, we know that in the 19th century, it was not risky at all to go to Eretz Israel. And even the second issue, there became more and more rabbis who wrote about mitzvot atliyot ba'aretz, and they came with later aliyot, as we mentioned, Chatam Sofer, the Prushim, the Hasidim, came to Eretz Israel. And they did manage to fulfill the mitzvot atliyot ba'aretz. So even that was not so powerful. Still, there is an opinion in the Rishonim that we don't have mitzvot Yeshuv Eretz Israel today, בזמן הזה, in our times. And also, once again, there is this idea of Shlosh HaShvuot, the 3 oaths, that was not ruled by the Rambam and by the Shulchan Aruch as halacha, but still it's there in the Gemara. And the radical Hungarian rabbi said that it's not only that there is no mitzvah to settle Eretz Israel, but even Adrabah, there is a prohibition to settle Eretz Israel in masses. Only few special Jews can go there, but as soon as it becomes a mass immigration, it's forbidden.
אבל יש רעיון ציוני גדול בשיטת הרמב"ן, שאומר שכל המצוות שאנחנו עושים בחוץ לארץ, זאת אומרת, זה רק להתכונן כשנחזור לארץ. אז זה רעיון מאוד, אפשר להגיד רעיון מאוד ציוני.
נכון. הציווי לציונים is a very Zionist idea that actually the entire קיום מצוות, fulfillment of the mitzvot is just in order to have them in Eretz Israel. Even the mitzvot that are not dependent on land are mitzvot that we can fully accomplish only in Eretz Israel. That's true. Ramban and Rambam are often presented as 2 different types, in which the Ramban is much more pro-Eretz Israel, and Rambam is more, I would say, cold or not so. He doesn't also enumerate the mitzvah of Eretz Israel in his Sefer HaMitzvot, and Ramban makes a reservation about that, a comment about that. You should put that in Sefer HaMitzvot. It's 2 different approaches in the Rishonim.
יש לי שאלה. מה היה דעה של החסידים והגאון מווילנה והליטאים ביישוב ארץ ישראל? הם שלחו תלמידים והכל. למה לא עשו יותר לפני כל הציונות החילוני?
So, of course, they did send. Now, by the way, by the Talmidei Agra, they said they also coped with this midrash of Shlosh HaShvuot, 3 oaths. What did they say? They said, okay, it was for a certain time, and now it's over. And also they said, the Goyim didn't play their part, so we're allowed to do our part. And also, later on, it was the Or Sameach who said that the San Remo Convention that approved the Balfour Declaration is, so there's no longer opposition from the nations of the world. We don't rebel against the nations of the world, so it's allowed. There are many reasons for that. And by the way, I can tell you also that Hasidei Karlin, the Karliner Hasidim, that were among the first ones to come to Eretz Israel already in the late 18th century, they came to Eretz Israel. Today, they are very, very proud. If you go to Karliner Hasidim, they are very proud. We were here much before Herzl, much before the Zionists. We didn't need Herzl to tell us what is Eretz Israel. Our rabbis told us what is Eretz Israel. Look at the letters that the rabbis write to the Chassidim in Eretz Israel. Yoshvei Eretz HaChaim. They knew the value of Eretz Israel much before Herzl. So they did say that. But as you know, many of the rabbis were conservative, were traditionalist, and even if they cherished the value of Eretz Israel, they didn't see it a practical issue. First of all, it's not a practical issue because the secularists are there, and it became dangerous from spiritual aspects. Also, but from really practical reasons. Parnasa, they have Hasidim. How can they send the Hasidim to the Eretz Israel if they know that they don't have a source of living? And they know that the Hasidim that did go there are asking from the Jews of the diaspora to send money. Yes, because they can't make their living by themselves. So how can I, as a responsible leader, send my follower to Eretz Israel when I know that it doesn't have a source of living there? So they had all kinds of sfekot. And you can also say another thing, which this is something that by Emma Banim Smecha said, very sharply, very critically, yes, Rabbi Tachtel said. Also, in some level, maybe there were also some, unconsciously, an egoistic aspect in that as well. They needed the Hasidim around them. If all of them go to Eretz Israel, it's a problem. You can say also that. I don't know. I'm not saying it myself. This is one of the criticism that Rabbi Teichtal makes against them.
תודה רבה.
תודה לכם.
תודה רבה לכם.
Good evening, לילה טוב. Here
לילה
it's
טוב.
almost 2 o'clock, so לילה טוב. Buenas noches.
ביי, כל טוב.
מאוד להתראות.